and welcome back to the second of our streams for hands-on Azure. In this session, we're going to be doing a little bit more and building up on some of the practical skills that we started with in our first session, which was creating an Azure website using the Azure Web Apps and App Service. So last time we were here, we actually did a very quick walkthrough of creating a free Azure account, so a $200 trial account, and doing one of the first things with it, which was deploying a static website, which you can see here now. So this is Miguel's site, .azurewebsites.net. You can check it out as proof that it's a real thing. And going back to the Azure portal, these were the services that we actually deployed to make it happen. So the first thing that we had, again, was an app service plan. This is essentially a container of your web application where you can actually host one-to-many apps. In this case, we use the free tier of the application of the app service plan. But of course, when we're moving into production, we probably want to use a higher tier service plan, something that can scale with our needs. We of course had the app service itself. So this was the website that we used to deploy the app, and we also had an application insights instance that was deployed. I'm not going to cover this right now. I will probably get into it a little bit later on in the session. But what we're going to do today is show you another way that you can take a static website and deploy it onto Microsoft Azure. And in this case, we're going to be doing a little bit differently. We're actually going to be using a mix of virtual machines, or what we call in Azure IaaS, or infrastructure as a service. And we're going to be taking applying a couple of techniques, practical techniques, to deploying your first VM, exposing it as a web application, and also increasing the availability and performance of our website. So just so you can see it, this is the site that we're going to be creating. It's the same site, but you'll see the URL is a little bit different. We have Miguel's site, .southeastasia.cloudapp.azure.com. And the first thing that we're going to do is create a new resource group for us to start working on our website. So we're going to move in here, add a new resource group. And this is very similar to how we started when we created our subscription the first time. So our last time we named ours demo-sea-rg. I can just call it vmsite-sea-rg and move that into Southeast Asia. Okay, so we're going to be doing this just so we can separate the resources that we created the first time from the resources that we have here in this new project. Okay, I don't need to apply any tags just yet. I'm just going to create this very quickly. And you'll see that just in a couple of seconds, we actually have the resource group created, and we can go to it straight from our notification bar, the one there at the top right corner. All right, the next thing we're going to do is actually one of the more basic sort of tasks that you would do when you're working with Azure, is deploying our first virtual machine. And in this case, we're going to be using Windows Server as a web server for our application. Okay, so from the resource group here, we're going to click on Add. And we're going to select one of the first options here. You can see right in the popular options. Last time we did the web app, but this time we're going to search for that top one here and go to Windows Server 2016. Now, of course, we don't have to use Windows Server 2016. We can use other options, but it is one of the popular ones that is available. Okay, so this is our interface for creating our first virtual machine. All right, now we can see that our resource group has already been pre-selected since we had done it from since we had clicked on New from the resource group. And the next thing we're going to do is give our virtual machine a name. So in my case, I might call it Miguel's site VM1. And I see that the name's not taken, so all good there. I can select my region. In this case, I'm going to be deploying to Southeast Asia. And for my availability options, I'm actually going to choose from one of these options here. Now, availability, pause very quickly here, is one of these concepts when we're working in the cloud, or when we're working with really any kind of technology product, a piece of software, an application, anything like that. Availability is one of these really important concepts that has to do with how much of percent of the time your application is accessible, right? How often can people go to your website and know that it's going to be up and running, right? It's not going to be down. When we work with cloud providers, like Microsoft Azure, we actually have a baseline of availability that we promise for our users. Now, this depends on the type of service that you're provisioning, and each time it's going to be a little bit different. But we know that when we provision a virtual machine in Microsoft Azure, that it's going to be available a certain percent of the time. These can be around 99, 99.5, 99.9. You're always going to see these playing around in percentages. People are going to be referring to these as percentages because that's the amount of time or percent of time that it's up. I forget the exact calculation, but I think a 99.5% of available application or machine in this case would only be down for a couple hours, maybe like 4 hours in a year. I think that's the definition for a 99.5. So, you can imagine that's actually really, really good, which is by just deploying a virtual machine here, we're able to increase the amount of time that our applications are available as compared when we may have a machine at home, or we may be running, something in a data center at the office, and it's a little bit harder to maintain those, with electricity, with all those different things that could fail. So we have a pretty good baseline of availability here, and we can increase that by applying one of these concepts, availability sets or availability zones. Now, these are slightly different. I won't get too deep into them, but I like the availability zone because when I work with a region like Southeast Asia, since I'm based in the Philippines and a lot of my customers are based in the Philippines, I can work with a data center that's very close to me that also has several separated zones within the Southeast Asia region that are isolated, that make sure that, if anything ever happens to something in one availability zone, the other two are not impacted. This means that everything can still be in Southeast Asia, still be very close, but I can still have a lot of isolation, a lot of really good performance and availability there. So I'm going to select one of the availability zones for this virtual machine, and I can maintain the Windows Server 2016 data center for now. I'm going to select my size. Now, of course, when you're choosing a virtual machine in Azure, you're going to have a lot of different requirements. Depending on the type of workload that you're using, you might want more processors, you might want more memory, you might need to have a GPU, and Azure Compute, which is our infrastructure as a service platform, has so many options. We actually have 270 different virtual machines that you can choose from, and the cost per month varies between varies amongst how much memory or how much compute power you're going to need at a certain time. So you can start for as low as $8 a month. Mine is going to be around $105 a month, and I'm okay with this one, so I'm going to maintain this option. Now, an important thing to note with Azure VMs is you're only charged for that virtual machine when it's up and running. So, for example, you look at a computer that you might have, like a very powerful computer, or maybe a gaming machine. You don't need to run that gaming machine 24/7, right? You might not be using a very expensive task for it all the time. So when you're not using it and you power it down, it's the same concept in the cloud where you can stop these machines and you won't be charged for anything that you've provisioned there. So it's a good way also to keep your costs very manageable, but still have very performant compute. Okay, so I've stuck with a DS1 V2 for my machine. And the next thing I'm going to do is specify an administrator account. So I can provide any credentials. I can go with, I probably don't want to say something like admin, so I'll just go with badmin. That works for me. And I'll add a password for myself. Okay, I don't want a securely generated password from Firefox, thank you. Okay, I'll use this one, make sure they match. And in my inbound port rules, I can leave this blank, or I can leave this as is right now, or I'm going to allow myself to access this machine using RDP, or a remote desktop protocol. Okay? And the last thing here, if I had a Windows Server license, now this is pretty unique to Microsoft Azure. If I have a Windows Server license, I can actually apply my license to this machine. I don't have it right now, and so I'm not going to do it. But I can apply the license to this machine and effectively bring down the price. It didn't make a difference so much for this one, but if I have larger machines and I have my Windows Server license, I can use that to bring the cost down. I can hear the mechanical keyboard. I'm just looking at the chat. Yes, so I have a mechanical keyboard, and if we have a little bit of time later on, I'm going to show you all what I'm using. Okay. So we click next, and we're going to move to our disks. Now, of course, with a computer, you need to have a hard drive, and that hard drive needs to have your operating system. So that's what we're going to start with here, is applying an OS disk. Okay? You can see that it's defaulted to a premium SSD, which is a solid-state drive. I have other options like a hard disk drive or a standard SSD. I can stick with premium SSD for now. It's fine with me. But if you're a little bit more conscious about the costs of your workloads, or you don't need something as performant, maybe you have a large farm of machines, you could probably go with something like standard hard drives and get away with that, right? But I'll go with what it tells me for now. Okay. After disks, we move into networking, and this is a concept I'll probably just touch very quickly because I want to keep on moving. But what we're doing here is creating a virtual network. Now, if you think about the network that you have at home, all the computers that you have at home and your Wi-Fi network, maybe your office, all the computers that are there in a local network, it's a similar concept to what you would be seeing in an Azure Virtual Network. Essentially what we're doing is we're sort of earmarking, or we're assigning a piece of territory where our machines, and then only our machines, our compute instances, will reside. And in this case, the virtual network is our way of defining how large that zone is, and all of the different computers or machines that reside within it. Okay, so this virtual network that we create, I can stick with this name for now. It's fine with me, but I would maybe want to change the size a little bit. So you can see here, when we create a virtual network, we're also asked to provide something called an address space. So in your case, if you had an office and you had a bunch of different machines, you would have a physical address space, right, where you have all of your computers that reside in a physical space, and that's how many computers you could logically fit in one area. But you would also have this virtual address space, or this sort of IP, or Internet Protocol address space, where each computer then is assigned an IP address by which they can actually communicate with other machines within the network, and potentially even communicate with other machines outside of the network, right? So the address range is how we define sort of like the size of our office. And in my case, I probably don't need a huge office. What I can do is I can change the number here, this number 24. I can make it a smaller or larger number so that I have a larger or smaller office. It actually works inversely. So the larger that number, the smaller my space is. I'm going to go with a /28, and you'll see that it gives me 16 addresses that I can logically deploy to. I think that's fine, so I'm going to keep this size for now. And I will also create a subnet also. So I have a web server subnet. I think that's fine. And I will give it a small address range as well. So I'm going to give it a 10.0.0.0/29, which is going to be 8 addresses, or half the space. So what you see I'm doing is I'm defining my area, and I'm cutting it in half just so I have a smaller address range there. Okay, so I'm all right with that. And you can see this updates now, where my subnet has populated to my web server subnet. So I'm good with that. Now in my public IPs, I'm going to keep this one as is. I do want to have a public IP for now. And I will keep most of this as is as well. This is mostly defined with how secure our virtual machine is going to be, like what are the different ways that we can access it, right? And in this case, we're going to be leaving one open, which is called RDP, a remote desktop protocol. You'll see this in use in a little bit. I can leave these other options blank and go straight to management. From management, I can also enable a couple of other options here. This is where if you have specific requirements for how you monitor the performance of your machines, maybe you're collecting information and such, you can set this here. I am okay with these for now, so I can leave them as default. In my advanced, I will probably leave all of this as default as well, and my tags leave as default. So right after networking, you probably don't need to touch anything, just go straight to that review and create. And you'll see, once it's validating our deployment, just making sure that it can deploy this, I have one last chance to review everything that I've set up, and I think it looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and click Create. Okay, so this is going to start creating, and it takes a couple of minutes to do so, but while this is going, I'm actually going to show you one that I had done beforehand. That's right, I am going Food Network style on this, and I have one that's already in the oven ready to come out. So I'm going to go back to one of my old resource groups, and you'll see that I actually have one with quite a few resources here. Okay, so one of the VM, I created a VM here called Miguel Site VM before. This is a virtual machine, and it was done quite similarly to the one that we had before. So we deployed it in zone 1 of our region. I know that it's roughly the same size. I'm using my 2016 data center, and I also have a public and private IP address. Okay, I can also see down here, similar to what we saw with the app service before, there are a couple of metrics that are being shown here on my machine, right? That it tells me a little bit about how the CPU has been performing, roughly around 3% CPU usage, how much of my network has been used, how much network is going in and out of the machine, how much my disk has been used, so how often is the hard drive writing new files or reading files, and what are my disk operations per second. Again, how many times is it reading or writing into the disk. And if this looks familiar, you might actually be familiar with a concept like your system manager, where if you right-click your start menu and click on your task manager, you actually will get something similar to that here, where you can see your CPU, your memory, if you have a GPU, what your GPU performance looks like. You'll actually have that information at your disposal. So it's a pretty cool way to stay on top or be able to monitor the performance of your machines. Okay, so I'm not sure if okay, actually the VM's done, so we can go straight to it. So I'm going to go to the resource, back to this deployment, and you'll see in this point we don't really have anything running here, and I'm going to actually connect to this virtual machine. Since we allowed it to use RDP, I'm going to show you how we can actually remote into the virtual machine. You can see that up here, similar to the one that I was showing earlier, I have a private IP address and a public IP address. Now the private IP address you'll see matches one of the names or something that we defined previously in that virtual network. The virtual network was a 10.0.0.0, and it had 16 spaces, 8 of which were in this machine. And I can see that this machine was actually assigned 10.0.0.4. So it has one of the addresses within that network. So it's similar to in the office, if I know where somebody's cubicle is, I can go to them and I can interact with them. In the same way here, in that virtual network, in that virtual space, I know that there's an address that points to this machine so that if anyone wants to go to it for something, they know which one to turn to. Now, a public IP address, which what you're seeing here before, is sort of how the rest of the world would access this machine, right? So if this machine, has a 52.237.97.116, I can go to my start menu and type RDP. So you open up your start menu and type RDP, and you can actually enter the IP address of this machine. Now, you're not going to be able to access it because you don't know my password, but you may be able to try doing the RDP in here right now. My password's all right, so I'm gonna enter that one first. Okay. And if it's good, it'll show me this little prompt here, just making sure that I'm sure I want to connect. And once I've done so, you're going to see a little window open up here that actually has my virtual machine. So this is actually my virtual machine now deployed in an Azure data center, in this case the Southeast Azure data center, but fully accessible by me and able to start using to deploy some web server workloads. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to deploy a very quick web server onto this, or deploy some files onto this, and then I'll go back to my other demonstration to show you some of the ways that we can improve it. Okay? So this is Windows Server 2016. This is my machine. Welcome. And the first thing that happens when it starts up is it loads up this Server Manager tool. This is a pretty simple tool for Windows Server where you can configure what your server is supposed to do. Right? Is your server a web server? Is your server a file server? Is it an email server? Is it an Active Directory server? There's so many different types of things that you can actually do with it, right? So this is where we actually define what it does. Now, if you're following along, once the Server Manager loads, what we're going to want to do is make sure that we can configure this local server, but what we're going to go straight to adding roles and features. So we're going to install a web server onto this. And the web server that we're going to be installing is called IIS, or Internet Information Services, right? So this is it's a web server software that is available on Windows servers. It's also available on your Windows 10 machine, but we're going to install it here. So I'm going to click Next. I'm going to do a role-based installation. All good. Next, next, next. Now in server roles is the first place we're going to have to apply a change. And what we're going to do is we're going to check the web server or IIS roles. We're going to add the feature. Sure, why not? Click Next, Next, Next. So that's really the only thing you had to do is just click that IIS one. And once you're done, it'll confirm that you're ready to install. So we just give this a couple minutes to install. And in the meantime, again, I'm going to get the code of my application, the one that I had before. I'm going to have that ready because I'm going to take that and put it here, okay? So I'll have the link for that either in the YouTube video afterwards or maybe share it a little bit towards the end once I'm back in my original browser. Okay, so installation here just takes a couple minutes. Now this is pretty cool, right? We're essentially starting from zero. We're starting from nothing. I'm doing quite a bit of talking, right? But a lot of the installation, it only really takes a couple of minutes to start up your VM. It only takes a couple minutes to install your web server onto it. And once we put our website code there, it's actually going to be up and running on the internet for people to see. And that's a pretty cool concept, right? So we'll just let that progress bar finish. Okay, we'll give that a sec. All right. So once this is done, I'm going to be taking my code, again, putting it in the file system here. I'll show you exactly where to put it. So if you're following along, you can do the same thing. And then we'll actually try to view it from within the web browser in the server, just so you know how it works, right? Okay. I think we should be good. All right. Okay, there we go. Looks like we're complete. So I'm going to assume that this is all done. Yep, all done. I'm going to go to this PC on my computer. I'm going to go to my Windows drive, my C drive. And you'll see that there's a folder here called inetpub. So this is essentially where your internet, your website files are going to go. And I'm going to drop them in my www root. So you can see right now there's an IIS start. And I can actually view this page by opening up my browser and going to my home or my local address. Now in this case, every computer's local address has the same one. So we're going to go to localhost. There's actually an IP address for it also, but we can start with this one. We'll go to localhost, and you'll see that we actually have Internet Information Services up and running. So this is good. But now what we're going to do is we're going to change the code so it actually has our real website. Okay? So I'm going to take my files. I'm going to copy them here. Okay. Just give it a minute to copy those files over. Okay? And I'm going to extract these files into that www root folder. So I can extract those. These two I can get rid of. The IIS starts I can get rid of. I don't really need them anymore. Okay. And I think that's good. I'm going to refresh my local host here. And you'll see that the files actually change, where it's now the Material Design Lite, right? Now the website itself looks a little bit different. It's really just more how it's more in the server security. It's blocking some images there. It won't be like that when we host it as a public website. Okay? So I know that my files are up and running, and I can verify this by going to my IP address and entering that in my browser. So I'm going to copy this IP address here. Okay? I'm going to open a new tab, paste it. Now here's the thing. It's not going to be loading anything just yet. And the reason that that is because of what we did earlier when we were setting how you can access this web server, when we only allowed RDP, right? So we only allowed the remote desktop protocol, but there are other ways that we need to be able to access this server, right? So what I can do is I can go back to my Azure portal. I'll just go to my, let's go back to the resource group just so we can see what's been created. Okay, so the VM site resource group. Now these were the resources that were created, right? We have the virtual network, we have the virtual machine, and network interface and disk. So you can see pretty much your basics when you have a server running in Azure is you're always going to have a disk for your operating system. You're going to have the machine, which is the compute and the memory, and you're going to have the network interface, which allows you to connect this, to your public network or to private networks. We're also going to have, this one's not always going to show up, but we are going to have a network security group. Now, it's highly recommended that you use network security groups to control how traffic can flow in or out of your virtual machine or your network as a whole. You can see when we created the virtual machine, we have an inbound security rule of RDP, meaning that somebody can connect to our machine through RDP. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more rule here, which also allows you to connect through HTTP. Okay, HTTP uses a port called port 80. And so we're just going to enter it here in our destination port. So I added an inbound security rule. I can leave those parts blank or as is. I'll change my destination port range to 80. Priority is fine. And I will just change the name to HTTP so I remember what it's for. Okay, so I'll create the security rule. Takes a minute to update. But once it does, I should be able to go back to this page, refresh it, and actually see a different type of website coming up. Okay, so we'll give that a minute to make sure that it's all good. We'll wait for that notification. Okay, looks like we're good. So we'll give that a test. Refresh one more time. Let's do it. Let's do it from cold. Make sure we're all right. Okay. All right. So I know, and just for reference, what you're going to see here is you're going to see a summary of your network security group. You have the custom security rules, and you also see what it's associated with, right? So you can review your rules, and you can also review what this network security group is pointing to. In this case, these rules that I've set are going to apply to this VM, right? And we applied it through the network interface card, right? So if I had a lot of different web servers, I would want them to use this set of rules because I want them to be accessible via HTTP. However, I might not want that for all of my machines, so I don't want to use this network security group for everything, right? And this is where you can actually create more secure environments for your deployments. Now that looked good, so I can go to that IP address. We can see that it's now rendering properly, and I have my website deployed on a single machine. So that's actually really good. We're doing pretty well here. But what are the ways that we can actually make this a little bit more available, right? So we used that concept of the availability zones so that we could deploy our virtual machine in Southeast Asia in a specific data center. But what happens if something were to happen to that data center? We would want to make sure that our application is still reachable via the public web. And what we would do is we would use another availability zone and deploy another virtual machine into that zone so that if anything were to happen in Southeast Asia 1, right, we always have Southeast Asia 2 or Southeast Asia 3 that would be able to access that website. Now, we can create another virtual machine. I'm going to hold off from that for now, but I'll show you one of the ways that we can actually connect. Let's imagine that we have two virtual machines, and what are the ways that we can make sure that with a single IP address, we can also point that to other machines, right? Right now, we only have one IP address, and that's associated to one virtual machine, right? Which means when we remote into this machine, we know we're remoting into one. when we're using HTTP, we're always using HTTP on that one instance. But we might want to have more than one to point to. And in this case, what we're going to do is create a load balancer. A load balancer is essentially just a piece of software that is able to distribute requests, like web requests, people accessing from their browsers, and pointing that to different machines so that they can return the web page, right? So we're going to our new dialog again, and we're going to search for a load balancer. Okay. So I'm going to click on Create. Here we have one here out of the box from Microsoft, and I'm going to call this. So if I call this Miguel's Site VM1, I'll call it Miguel's Site LB1. Okay. And I am going to make this a public load balancer. I will go with a standard SKU load balancer. I think that should be fine. And I'll create a public IP address also for the load balancer. So you can see that the load balancer, we can apply the IP address to a load balancer. So it's a single endpoint, like a single website address, but then it can go to any number of machines. And this is how the largest applications, your Netflixes, your Facebooks, these are some of the techniques that they use to make sure that their application can scale and reach a lot of people, right? So I will just call mine Miguel's Site IP, right? I think that should be fine. I can deploy it to an availability zone, sure, why not? And I think I'm good, no need to apply tags. Let's review and create it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the things that you can configure in the load balancer. But since we don't have two VMs, I do have one that's pre-created, and I'll show you how we configured it there also to make that one work. Okay? So our deployment is underway. This one should just take a few minutes again to do so. We'll wait for the notification. There it is. So we can go to the resource. And there are a couple of things that we're going to be configuring here. The first one, and we can see it in our settings, so we can kind of just work our way down the settings. The first one is our front-end IP configuration. This is where you can assign an IP to the load balancer, and that can be a public or a private one. And I see for mine, okay, this is fine. I know that I have a public IP pointing to my load balancer. It doesn't do anything right now, so if you were to check that out, I don't think it would have anything up there. Okay, but let's move on. The next thing is our backend pools. Now, a backend pool is like what I said. When we use the IP address to access a website, that's going to point to any number of machines. And the way that we dictate which machines exist in those is through the backend pool. So the backend pool, I'll just call mine Miguel's backend pool, and I will associate it with my virtual network that I created. And I can select the VM that I created here and the first IP address of it and add that to my backend pool. So that should already be good. Okay. So wait for that one to finish up. While that's going, I'm going to go into my health probes and add something else here. So a health probe, now somebody might have to correct me in the chat, but health probe is essentially our way of making sure that all of the machines in our pool are accessible via the defined endpoint. In our case, it was HTTP protocol that we were using. So we want to make sure that all of these machines are accessible via HTTP. If they're not, we shouldn't be directing traffic to that. And that's how your load balancer can identify if something happened in Southeast Asia 1 and it should start sending something to Southeast Asia 2, right? So we can just call it HTTP probe. That's fine. We know that port 80 is for HTTP, and it's going to check that in a 5-second interval. If it sees 2 consecutive failures, then it will deem that machine to be unhealthy, and it won't direct traffic to that one for a while. Okay? So we create our probe. We're also going to create a load balancing rule. Now that rule is something we're going to apply here, so I'll just create HTTP rule. So we're going to just put some defaults here. I can leave it as IPv4 and use this front-end IP address. Now the load balancing rule, the way this one works, is it will take it knows that certain machines are always going to be busy, right? We're not just doing static website. We could be doing something like serving videos or serving, a game server, and we may not want to point traffic to a game server that is already busy. Or, if somebody's logged into a shopping application, we may not want to give them to a different server when they're already accessing one. The load balancing rules are what help us sort of dictate how the traffic gets distributed amongst our different servers in the backend pool. So you can see I have my front end here, my backend that's been configured, and my health probe. And for session persistence, I can define if I want client IP protocol. The way this works is, like I said with a shopping example, right? It may be that you have a server that has the person's shopping data at that time, right? And if you were to send traffic to another server that doesn't have the shopping data, then their cart would be empty if they refresh the page. And of course they don't want that. When we do something like session persistence, we can make sure that if I and my machine am accessing this website for the second time, the third time, fourth time, fifth time, it should try to go to the same machine as much as possible so that they don't lose that experience, or they don't lose any items in their shopping cart, right? There are other ways that you can design for it, but in our case, I'm okay with no session persistence because it's just a basic website, okay? And I am all right with these other ones, so all I needed to set was my name pretty much for this, and I can click OK. Okay, so I have my load balancing rule already good. And I believe that should be it. That should be enough for us to view this machine. So I'm going to go ahead and check out the IP address of our load balancer, which is 52.237.97.117. Open that one up, and there you go. So it's pointing to our same website now, but instead of doing it through a virtual machine, so connecting directly to the virtual machine, we're connecting through a load balancer, right? And this is one of those ways that eventually, when we want to scale up or have a more available application, we can use these services so we're not always just relying on a single machine. Okay? So that was a load balancer. And, one last thing. You don't always access sites by just a 4-number IP address, right? It's not the most convenient way to access it. You might want to add some names or a domain to your website. And what we can do is we can actually go to our site here, this website, and go to the IP address that we provisioned for it. Which IP address were we using? Miguel's site IP. There it is. Okay. And you'll see that we have our IP address, we have some information on the IP, and we can go to the configuration of the IP address, and we can actually set a name for it. So if I don't want to have to access it by the IP, I can set maybe Miguel's site LB. So we know that it's the load balanced website, right? And it's always going to default to the southeastasia.cloudapp.azure.com. So what it's doing right now is just checking that that name is available. It is. So we're going to save that. And when we do this, okay, once it's saved, I can change, instead of going to that IP address name, I can go to Miguel's site LB, just a minute, .southeastasia.cloudapp.azure.com, refresh that, and there you go. So our website now has an actual name, right? Which is pretty cool. If you have a custom domain, you can actually also apply your custom domain, so it can go to miguel.com or miguelarcilia.com or whatever your website is. We won't go into that now. We'll just go as far as here. But we've effectively created a potentially scalable and highly available application using the load balancers and virtual machines in an Azure environment. So congratulations. Very good. Now, I'll show you a couple of ways that we can continue to improve, and I'll show you something that I had created before, right? So what I have working here is, so you can see there's a lot more resources than we had before, so I'll do my best to simplify this. You can see that I have a lot of the same things, those virtual machines, my load balancer, and my public IP addresses, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with this base and actually improve it, or make some security and performance improvements to the deployment that we created, right? Okay, So what we have here is, and you'll see also I have the app service stuff that we did in the first session. I'm going to get rid of this, and the way I'm going to do that is by filtering my tags, and I'm going to filter my tag to only show the public website resources. Okay, so you can see, you had seen when we were creating resources before, it always gave the option of applying tags. Now, when you're naming things in Azure, there can be cases where the name isn't always going to be super indicative of what that service is. We're lucky enough that we have very small needs, and Miguel's site VM is very clear what that's going to do. But not everything is going to be that clear, especially if we're automating in the cloud. We may find that it's going to start creating things for us with just random names. And when you're in the cloud, you can provision machines that quickly. You may just need randomly named machines. But so that we don't lose track of what those names are, we can use things like tags so that we know where things should apply. Now, all of these are going to apply to my public website, and I'll walk you through what we've created and, again, what these resources are for. So we can start from the bottom, or maybe I'll just change the alphabetical sorting. The first thing that we have is our virtual network. Again, this is sort of our defined virtual address space where all of our computers and compute resources will reside. We have two virtual machines. So I have one in availability zone 1, one in availability zone 2. I have a diagnostic storage account. So this is, again, where any of the usage data of my machines can be here. So I can identify if there are any issues with the applications, or if anybody tried to access my machine, right? If there was any malicious attackers, I can identify this faster. I also have 3 public IP addresses, one for each machine and one for my load balancer. I don't need that many. And of course, when you're doing a production level deployment, you probably don't want to have that many public IP addresses because these are essentially endpoints that people can access you from. You'd rather just have one, like this domain name. So limiting those public IP addresses and making sure that your virtual machines are not available publicly is pretty important. It's a good practice to have. So we'll review that in a bit. We also have the network security group, as we showed before, the network interfaces of the 2 machines, our load balancer. We have our 2 disks for the operating systems, an application insights instance, and the application gateway. So this one is quite different. This is not one that we've actually discussed before. Now, an application gateway is actually quite similar to a load balancer in that it helps us distribute traffic from a single endpoint into many different machines. It's a little bit different from a load balancer because it uses a protocol we call layer 7, or sort of application level routing, where a load balancer uses level 4, which I believe is the network routing. I won't go into what those different OSI layers mean, so I'll probably just attach a link to what OSI layers are and how we differentiate them. But an application gateway is also a pretty effective way for us to define how traffic goes to our machines. I'll show you how mine is configured. We won't configure it today. It takes about 20 minutes to deploy a first one, so we won't do it right now. But I will show you here that it's quite similar to the load balancer where we have different rules, probes, and backend pools. So I'm going to go to my backend pool and show you that I have 1 rule and 1 target associated. In this case, the target is a local IP address of 192.168.0.6. Now that actually is the address not of a single machine, but of my load balancer. So it's almost like a couple of levels of load balancing, where my app gateway is going to point to my load balancer, which is then going to distribute to any one of those 2 machines, right? But just to show you that how that is working, I'm going to remote into one of these machines. So I'll remote into this one while it's still public. I'll use my remote protocol to RDP into that machine. Okay. And just so we know, that website again is accessible here at Miguel's site, Southeast Asia Cloud App, not Miguel's site LB. So if you're playing along at home, you can try this one, Miguel's site, southeastasia.cloudapp.azure.com. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually in one of the pre-created virtual machines, and I'm going to edit the code very, very slightly, right? So you can see this is a website, and this is the HTML code for the website, rather. And I'm going to change the name here from Material Design Light to Miguel Design Light. I think that's fine. Okay? Yeah, I'll just do a very simple change there. Okay? Just so we can see that it's actually going to be different. Now, what I'm going to do is, we know that it's Material Design Light, and it's two machines, and we know that one of them has Material Design Light, one of them has Miguel Design Light. I'm going to start refreshing this kind of crazily. All right, so I'm going to start hitting. And pay attention to the name here at the top. And you can see it starts shifting eventually from Material Design Light to Miguel Design Light. It'll take a couple minutes to be done serving, but you can see it starts switching between the two. And this is proof that we actually have load balancing working, where it's starting to send the request from our browser into one of those two machines. Now, ideally, it's going to be the same code in all those machines, so that people don't see a different experience when they log into your website or refresh the web page. But this is one of those ways that we're able to, again, distribute traffic, and I'm able to prove that my load balancing is working as it should. Now, the next thing I want to do is actually start cleaning up my instances. And one of the ways that I can do this is going to my network security group and start working on those inbound rules that I have and removing the ones that I don't necessarily need, right? So RDP is not going to be, it's not a good idea to keep RDP open. So you do want to remove this one, right? So I'm going to remove that. That means I can't necessarily access through the public, that public IP address, but that means that other people can't either, which is pretty important. Now, one other way that I can also simplify my life here is, rather than using my network security group and applying it to each of my network interfaces of my virtual network, I can actually associate it to a subnet of the virtual network, which means that anything that exists in that web server subnet that we created before, right? Or in my case, I have a subnet called web subnet. I know that it's going to apply to them by default. And this is, again, one of those ways where your database may have very different requirements from your website. So you can associate at the subnet level to make things a little bit easier to maintain. And that means you can start dissociating from the network interface level, because it's already going to be applied at the subnet stage. Okay? Now, this also means that I may not necessarily want to have public IP addresses for my app, right? Miguel's site IP, I probably want to maintain that one because that's the one for the load balancer. But I eventually want to start dissociating also my public IPs from the virtual machines. This means that there's no way that people can access my virtual machine unless they also are within my virtual network, right? We'll probably discuss how you get access to the virtual network in another session, but this is one of those things that you need to take account of when you start to move towards production. What this also means is, once you've dissociated these resources, you can actually also start to delete them. Now, we've already been covering creation. We hadn't really covered deletion before. So deleting is actually quite easy to do. So I can go to my IP address after I've dissociated it, go to delete, and just set it up for deletion. And once it's gone, you'll see it's going to be removed from my resource group. I'm no longer going to be charged for it, which is also a good thing. So that's also important with the cloud, is when you don't have the resources anymore, when they're not running anymore, you're not charged for them. And it's a way to make sure that you keep track of your expenses and you don't overspend on the projects that you're building. Okay? So I'll delete those two. I have my network security group associated. I have my load balancer and my application gateway properly configured. We showed how you would do it live with a load balancer. I won't do the application gateway today because it takes a little while to deploy again. But I think if you've been following along so far, you've essentially created your very first public website using Azure Virtual Machines and exposing it over the public internet using load balancers to increase your availability and your effective performance in the cloud. So that's actually pretty much where I want to close up for today. maybe one last thing, since we have been deleting resources, I want to show you one cool trick to make sure that you don't ever accidentally delete a resource. When you're in a resource group or a certain resource, you have something here in your settings called locks. Now my locks are actually ones that I can apply that would say maybe no delete. And I have a lock type that is a read only or delete. And what this does is read only is going to be quite strict, where it won't allow you to change any of the properties of your virtual machine or of any of the resources in that group. And delete makes sure that you can't delete any of them. Okay, so I can actually apply a lock here, and you'll see that if I ever try to go back and delete a resource, let's say maybe my application insights resource here, if I were ever to try and delete this one, it would fail because I actually have a lock on my resources there. So this is one of those things where if you're working in the cloud, again, it can be a little bit scary because it's all virtual infrastructure, right? It's not like having a computer that you can hug and you can keep in your office and you know that it's always there. It's never going to be deleted necessarily. But by applying these locks and applying the right types of management tools to your Azure environments, you can make sure that you're keeping down your costs, that you're ensuring that things don't get deleted, and you're having a more secure deployment that is able to work once you start applying this into production level readiness. Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to be closing up the stream for today. Thanks to everybody who joined in. Hopefully it was pretty enlightening. This will go up on demand, both on the Mixer site, and I'll have a version of this uploaded to YouTube as well. But thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next one.